I've noticed it's probably more to do with the YouTube algorithm than anything else. But you know how when you watch a video and you like it and you watch it all the way through, YouTube goes, "Oh, you like that video? Here's a shitload more of the same thing." So it's maybe just that. But these are all recent videos, and it's people making cassette loops is one of the features of this thing.
Oh, like Heinbach.
Yeah, Heinbach's probably done it. I haven't seen him doing it, but it's the kind of thing he would do. In fact, he may be the progenitor of all this, I don't know. But it's a number of different people all making cassette loops and then running old reel-to-reel machines next to that. And they've got something coming off the reel-to-reel, they've got something looping, and then they've got a modular system or some other kind of modern system next to that. And what you get is this to me, it takes me back to my childhood, but when I was experimenting with tapes, this lumpy kind of harmonically distorted, hissy mess that I spent most of my early life trying to get away from, trying to ameliorate and control. And now people are just embracing it all, and it's like, I guess it's lo-fi. There's always been that lo-fi aspect to things. But I wondered if you'd come across that at all, and whether in your music making you're thinking about you sort of mixing up the modern emulations of analog gear with the actual kind of analog gear.
Absolutely, yeah. I've talked about this a bit. Maybe not with you as much, but I've always been that's always been part of my music making, kind of like I don't know what the word is, but it's part of my aura or my mythos, because I love exemplifying mistakes and exemplifying like fuck ups and repeating them over and over again and using them to their own like in one of my songs off of, I can't remember if it was like the Robot album or the Everything album, I unplugged the patch cord one time with the delay pedal on still. And it was like, and I was like, that sounded cool. So I cut like a 1 second clip of it, and that loop became the rhythm of the next song. Like this,
sure.
And it's, you know, and I left the whole like unplugging in there. So it sounds like you're like, oh shit, he unplugged something. And then all of a sudden that just becomes the spiral into the song.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh my God, what a fucking madman. Right. So when I was listening to Smashing Pumpkins growing up, Melancholy and Infinite Sadness, the very first song of the album, has got this beautiful piano that's accompanied with orchestral parts played on a mellotron, right? And I didn't know it was a mellotron. I thought it was an actual orchestra playing. And I was like, why would they hire an orchestra and then fuck it up like that? Like make it out of tune and make it all, right?
Yeah.
So I remember thinking like the Smashing Pumpkins are awesome. They'll make this beautiful song and just smudge it, make it sound shitty. Right, and I didn't realize they were just using a mellotron. They're just using something that reminded them of probably the Beatles and Led Zeppelin and like King Crimson, right? So like that scratchy, nostalgic vibe I got from hearing a mellotron became something I loved. And then when I first started recording digitally, I bought Line 6 gear. I'm a Line 6 guy, which I think you know. I use a lot of Line 6 stuff. I still do. And when you buy like a pod, it comes with software called Gearbox or Pod Farm, depending when you bought it. Mm-hmm. And one of the effects in there was called I forget what it's called. Tape Eater. It's called Tape Eater. Right. So it'll make you can make your music sound like it's going through a broken tape, and you can control how damaged the tape is. But if you put a little bit on, it kind of sounds like a tape. But the more you push it, the more just fucked up it sounds. It doesn't sound like a tape. It just sounds like its own thing. So Tape Eater is like a previous version of that. But now companies like Arturia have made software since, like in the last 20 years, that sound a lot like tape. So I have an Arturia effect that Arturia gave away for free a couple of years ago called lo-fi tape, and it's basically an emulator of a mellotron that you can add on to any track. You can make anything sound like it's coming through a mellotron.
Right.
You know, so I like that. Now I remember back when I first started making Death by Design music, before I had the name Death by Design, I'm still trying to get this album finished. My buddy Liam, it's like 10 years in the making now. He's dragging his ass, but I'm being patient. I had recorded something where I was intentionally clipping something. I was clipping it deeper and deeper in digital distortion until it sounded like nonsense. And he was like, dude, the clipping's too much. Like, you can't be clipping things. And I'm like, why not? Like, who the fuck are you, George Martin, telling me I can't distort shit? You know, like, you know, like Jimi Hendrix used to cut holes in his speakers because the fucking speaker, because there was no pre-drive yet. There was no preamp in his amp, right? So they had to, like, you know, people did things to make things sound worse for centuries. We've been doing that, right? So I've been trying to explain to him, I said, just because clipping sounds bad to you, it's because you're old. I said, the kids are going to get it. The kids are going to love digital clipping. And they do. I hear clipping all over the place now that would be considered bad, right, back in the day. And then I downloaded a piece of a VST I have in my computer here that's free. I forget the name of it now, but I think it might be called Codec. And the idea is that it's a VST that imparts that MP3 compression on the sounds. And you can bring it right down to 8 bits. Like, so it just sounds absolutely terrible.
Yeah.
And I use it all over the place now. Like, I intentionally put MP3 distortion and compression into my parts, and I modulate it. So, like, it's waving in and out and whatnot.
Yeah, can I ask you about that then? Because I've noticed something recently. I got, many, many years ago, I bought a reel-to-reel tape recorder. I was in a market in Glasgow called the Barras, which is infamous, or it was in those days. And this guy had an old reel-to-reel tape recorder, and which I got, and it came with a tape, which is the tapes cost more than the machines now. And I've got it there because I intend at some point, probably not on the album I'm working on just now, but I intend at some point to actually test the actual sound of old analog equipment against some of the emulations, like you're talking about, the bitrate reducers or the tape emulators, because to my ear, being if you like, a graduate of the school of shitty sound, which, as I say, I spent my whole career trying to get away from, what I'm hearing in all of these VST emulations is, let's say you've got a guitar and you want it to sound Mellotron-y or whatever you want it to sound like. Let's say you want to make it sound like it's coming off an old tape. Right, so what do you have to think about? Well, you have to think about the tape hiss. You have to think about mechanical noise, if you want that in, or electronic noise, like the 50 or 60 hertz hum that would have been there. And you need to think about harmonic distortion, because tapes had a kind of weird harmonic distortion, and you also have to think about saturation. So all of those things are emulated in VSTs now. Sometimes they're even in the synthesis engine that you'd be running. But to me, what I hear is the original signal, and then I hear a layer of this stuff on top. And the original signal is not, to me, modulated. It's just you've added extra stuff on, and the original signal you can still hear. Whereas my memory, and I'm only going by memory, of real analog gear was that the sound became the distortion and the saturation. There was no separation between them. The sound kind of disappeared into it. There's no layering. It is the sound. And I just wonder if you've got any perspective on that, if you've done any experiments like that, because I think what I'm going to find is that modern VSTs, and I'm noticing this with synthesis as well, that modern VSTs, I've listened to so many. There's a guy, I can't remember his name and give him a shout out. I'll try and put it in the notes for this when it goes out, or I'll put it on screen or something. But he reviews every VST he can get his hands on. He does about 2 or 3 of them every day. So reverb units, synthesizers, all that. So I've listened to shitloads of synthesizers. The number of free synthesizers out there it's frightening, and they all sound the fucking same. Even when you move on to the likes of wavetables, all the synthesizers that are doing wavetables all sound the same. The only things that sound different are those that are based on samples, and then it depends on what they've sampled. Like the Arturia augmented strings and augmented voices sound different from everything else because they've sampled different things. And I just wonder, because you do analog, you make things up and record things that way. I don't do a lot of that these days. I just wonder, do you hear that as well, or am I just out on a limb here?
You hear things I'm not hearing a lot of the time, which is like, it makes me question the quality of my listening abilities, or whether I'm distracting myself.
No, it's me that's cursed, believe me.
Well, it's a curse. It's a blessing, because like I'm right now I'm mixing part 1 of Taste the Future, and there's 2 tracks on the first one that you've critiqued over the last year. One was the song Taste the Future, which is one of the first songs of mine you critiqued, and then I forget the other one you critiqued in the last few months. and I'm doing my best to take your advice, and I'm getting really good at using the spectrum analyzer. Because I used to use the EQ as an analyzer, because like I'm in the Isotope 7, which is one I still use for the most part. It shows like where the sound's bouncing inside the EQ, and I would, if I heard a sound that was offensive to me, and it sounded like it was high or low or mid, I would just look for the spike and then just kind of drag down the EQ where that spike is, and I'd be like, oh, that got rid of that fart or that sound that sounded like it was like, you know what I'm talking about, where a sound kind of like, it kind of just gets too much that most people might not notice. They might blame the speakers, not realize the mix of the problem, right? You know, so I've been doing that a lot, but I'm still struggling. Like I find myself, like I'd love to see how fast you can mix, or maybe you're a slow mixer. I don't know. Maybe I don't know how fast you can mix a song or an album, but sometimes it takes me like weeks to get a song right, because I'll mix it down, then I'll take it, I'll leave it for a day, come back and listen to it, and then it's all off. Like I'm like, how could it sound so off? I thought it sounded great yesterday, but I know your ears get tired. You got psychoacoustics going on. Your brain is intentionally fixing things for you that aren't actually being fixed, right? So you have to decompress before you can come back and listen to it again. But I'm struggling. I really am struggling to make it sound the way I need it to. But it's coming together better, and I feel like every record I mix sounds better than the album before it for the most part. It's hard to tell with my discography because they didn't come out in chronological order. Yeah. So I'd have to like draw you a map, you know. But so, sorry, short question, long answer. I don't know. I don't know if I'm noticing it as much. I do notice sometimes when I do stack an analog recording up to a digital recording, I can hear like extra qualities of things that are being like forgotten. You know, like I sent you a patch that I made up on Pigments probably 2 months ago. It was I took a sine wave sound and turned it into tried to make it sound like a xylophone, right? A vibraphone sound, you know, and I made it and I thought it sounds very convincing to me. Like this sounds like a very clean, very nice vibraphone, but I put it up to a vibraphone, it sounds nothing like a vibraphone. But in the absence of a vibraphone, it sounds exactly like a vibraphone.
Yeah.
Right? You know, and personally I'd like it more because it's easier because the vibraphone's got all these artifacts and harmonic distortions that I don't want. I want the sine wave, like right where I fucking put it. Right. Yeah. So I've been finding myself constantly battling between analog sounds and digital sounds, having complete control and having no control, you know, and then, or like filtering out sounds. Cause I'm still having a hard time with that because I love the sound in the room, right? Like I love the way, I love when I plug in my half stack and I play the guitar so loud, the whole house is vibrating and the guitar is feedbacking, and that inspires me to play a certain way and do certain things I wouldn't do with headphones on. Right. You know, but then I put a mic in front of it and I go, that does not sound anything like how I felt it sounded. But then I do the digital version and use impulse responses and amp simulators, and I get closer to the sound that was in my head in the room, you know? So I'm constantly trying to find this thing that, like, I'm making music that doesn't exist, that, you know, like I've realized in the last year that I'm no longer a musician. Like I am a studio engineer, right? Like my instrument is my two speakers in front of me, and it's all about how does it sound coming out of my speakers. Who gives a shit what it sounds like in the room and whether it's analog or not, or how close it sounds to the real thing. You know, like actually, I remember one of the songs you critiqued on me at one point. I've been obsessed with this fusion between classical music and synthesizers in the last year, right? Like where I have like this bombastic Nine Inch Nails sounding song that all of a sudden sounds like it's Gustav Holst or something, right? Just all these horns come in. I remember I showed you one of those, and you said, like, in the one faux orchestra part, the one horn you pick sounds too synthesizer-y. And I didn't reply to it because I actually used augmented horns for that. I was using Arturia's augmented brass, and it was a mix between, it was a synthesizer and a brass I used as the lead instrument. So I could see why you thought, well, why would you have all these beautiful acoustic instruments and then this horn that sounds like it's half a keyboard right in the middle of it? But that was part of the fusion. I wanted it to be disjointed. When you're going like, am I listening to orchestra or is this an asshole with a keyboard? What the fuck is happening? Right? That's kind of like my goal, right? So it wasn't a critique. I think you just thought my intention was different, right? So, which made me kind of solidify me knowing that because it sounded out of place to you was what I wanted it to sound out of place. I wanted it to sound like, why does that horn sound like it's not a horn when everything else sounds like it's an orchestra? Because it was all sampled orchestra stuff and then an augmented horn in there. You know, so I'm not hearing what you're hearing necessarily, but I am definitely like pushing that button of I want my listeners, yourself included, to hear like to not know what you're hearing. Like I want it to be like, is that a bongo or is that a synthesizer? you know.
Yeah.
And like I wrote a song recently. I think I told you I was working on it. No, well, I should say recent. It was 2 months ago, or maybe a month ago, where I used my Behringer. I'm pointing at it right here. My Behringer neutron, where every instrument on the song is a neutron. Right? Like I made a kick sound out of it. I made a snare sound out of it, and every lead, bass, every instrument is the neutron. And I've been like loving that. It's where I made a song too. I gotta send you. I keep meaning to. Like I said, I don't like sending you songs because I feel guilty because you automatically go into critique mode. I don't want to waste an afternoon, you know. And I know I know you say it's okay, but at the same time, I know it's a burden. But I made a song out of mouth noises, like I told you I was making.
Yeah, you said that. Yeah.
And I've shown it to people, and they're like, "Yeah, that's cool." But within a minute or so, they've completely forgotten its mouth noises, and they don't believe me anymore, because like it's metallic sounding. It sounds like it. It sounds like a synthesizer. It sounds like a Nine Inch Nails song. Like it doesn't sound like every single thing is a voice. But I was trying to show that like with frequency modulation and EQ, I can make anything sound like anything, right?
Of course,
like,
yeah.
So, right, like there's like for the bass line, I'm going like boom, boom, ba-doom, boom, ba-doom kind of stuff. Yeah. But I don't just do that. Like I actually just sampled my voice going like boom, and then I take that and I put a high pass or a low pass filter on it. You know, and I really spike the 100K, you know, or the 100 hertz, you know, and I put a bit of a spike at 500, but then I roll it off around 40, and I like put a bit of a scoop between the 100 and the 500, and then it sounds like a very synthetic, like dubstep thump, right? You know, but I still hear the quality of my throat a bit. But if you didn't know it was someone's voice, you would never think it was. You know, so I find that neat that like when I try and present something to somebody, they hear it and they go like, "I'm not hearing the brilliance. You just use a bunch of synthesizers here." And I'm like, no, I didn't. Like, this is all my voice. 100%. Now, I did use Pigments a lot as a sample engine to manipulate my voice, right? Because Pigments is so brilliant for that. Like, I use I use the granulator, and I use all the arpeggiators and stuff. Like, I got some stuff in there that sounds like I said, it's right out of a Nine Inch Nails song, or maybe even more. Like, I sent it to my one buddy, and I forget which two musicians he compared it to, but it was like these two pop, like one was like Timbaland and somebody else. And I was like, really? Like, those two musicians aren't influential on me in any way at all. But I find it weird that you hear my song and that's where you think my influences are coming from. You know, but my one friend, when I convinced him, I showed him all the tracks. Like, we did like a screen share. Because I got a friend I used to make music with, and we both use the same DAW. And we often share, like you and I share VSTs together and like things that we found. Him and I do the same thing. And unfortunately, his mixes suffer. Like, he's not very good at mixing his own music. He uses too much distortion on his guitars. He has a hard time, I think, figuring. He has a sound in his head. He doesn't know how to get there. So I'd love to mix his music, you know, and try and. I think I have a better time getting it to where he thinks it should go. And maybe I'm completely out of touch. I really don't know. But I sent him the song, and he had the same response. Like, yeah, the voice part was cool at the beginning, but like, it got real digital near the end. So I said, come here. So we did a screen share, and I showed him every track of the song and showed him all the samples. And then he realized, oh my God, every sound is your voice. Like, when you said it's all your voices. And the lyrics are all about what's happening in the song. And like, remember, I told you it's all about the idea about this robot from the future trying to talk to people in the past.
Right.
Well, this idea, this robot is having a hard time communicating. So the robot's idea is, I'm going to make a human voice. But I'm not a human, so I got to use synthesizers to frequency modulate a human voice so I could talk to people.
Yeah.
And that was this idea that this robot's trying to talk to you. And the song is its robot trying to say these things to you. And the voices are all getting scattered and jumbled.
Yeah,
and
I love that. That's a brilliant concept. Yeah, I love that.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Yeah, so, you know, that was a lot of fun. So I come from the perspective of someone who really, really enjoys all avenues of where the sound came from, whether it involves harmonic distortion from tapes, scratchy records. Like, I take songs, I put record scratch on them so they sound like it's a scratchy record. Intentionally. Like, add the clicks and the pops and everything. And like, I have an Isotope program I downloaded for free like 10 years ago called Isotope Vinyl.
Yeah, I know that one. That's a good example of what I'm talking about. That sort of thing. You see, when you actually play vinyl, as you know, but you'll know this anyway, if the record's fucked up or your needle's fucked up and there's a lot of surface noise, there's a harmonic distortion that goes along with the for example, the needle not tracking properly. There's harmonic noise that goes along with that becomes part of the actual signal. And I think what all these emulations are doing, including that one that you're talking, that Isotope one that you're talking about, they don't get there. They put something on top and leave the signal unregulated, as it were. And I just wonder why that is. And like I was saying, I've listened to all of these VST synthesizers. You know, now you could say, for example, a square wave is a square wave is a square wave is a square wave. I mean, it's a square wave. What else could it be, right?
Yeah, just wider or narrower. That's
wider or narrower. But I saw some guy scoping different VSTs, and the I don't even know how to say the name, but the U-HE, U-HE, whose synths I identified as sounding different. He scoped one of their square waves, and it wasn't a square wave. What it had was the transition from one phase to the next had a little spike, either down or up. So there was a colour there that wasn't in the other ones. So yes, a square wave is a square wave is a square wave until somebody does something different. And I think what's happening is behind. I haven't been able to find this out, and I don't know if it's. I don't know if I'm just talking out my arse here or not. I probably am, but it sounds to me like behind the scenes there's one protocol that everybody's using, like one software design system that everybody's using to generate the same waves. And like when they have a filter, it's the same filter, it's the same envelope, it's the same ring modulator, and people are designing these things, and you've got like 1,000 emulations of analog synthesis that all sound exactly the fucking same. And this guy who does it, who I'll try and give a credit to, I usually leave a comment on his videos, and I've just resorted to talking about the colour of the VST, because that's the only difference as far as I can see with most of them. With 99% of them, they all sound the same. And I just wonder, I don't like the analog domain, generally speaking. I don't think records sound better than CDs. I don't think cassettes sound better than CDs. You know, I'm firmly convinced that the digital realm is where we belong.
I agree. But
I just wonder if there's some value in the actual analog way of doing things. You know, like actual transistors and valves do sound different than the digital emulations of them. I'm sort of coming round to the idea that they probably do sound different, and that what we're actually getting in a lot of these VSTs is just layering that's not actually anywhere near being real. Because if you think about it, if you hear people going back to games for a minute, people who play driving games talk about the car as if it's real, as if they really are in a car. Oh, the suspension on this one's a bit soft. Oh, I need more revs for the engine. And I'm thinking, there's no car. What are you talking about? You're talking about CPU cycles and graphics and response to your control inputs, but there's no car, but you're talking about it as if it's real. And people do the same thing with VSTs. They talk about them as if they are really there, they're really real. And digital synthesizers as well. People will talk about their digital synthesizer, which is a hardware unit, as if it really does have valves and circuits and, you know, a real oscillator with the output going back into the input to oscillate. You know, it doesn't. It's just an emulation. And fashion would tell you, or fashion dictates, that what they emulate is what you want to hear. That's really what they're doing. You're not really hearing the real analog sound. What you're hearing is what they think you will like as the analog sound.
Yeah, I that's kind of what my experience has been, and kind of what I've found is that I've grown to appreciate the cheapness of poor emulation, because it becomes its own,
becomes its own thing.
Like the MP3 codec thing, right? Like MP3s aren't a good thing for music, other than it makes them easier to share, right? But that, for me, I grew up in a Napster world, right, where people are sharing 64 kilobyte MP3s that have been like copied 3 times, right? And it sounds more like broken glass than the original song, right? But like sometimes that's the first time I heard a song was that way, you know? And like that's, for me, that's what I fell in love with, was the broken MP3 sound, right? So I think, and I think it's like, you take a look at guitar emulation. I've been using amp simulators longer than amplifiers, right? Like my main amp is a simulated amp. It's a Line 6 amp. There's nothing real in that amp. It's all digital, right? And I think it sounds fantastic, but it doesn't sound like a real amp. It sounds like a Line 6 product to me. And because of that, I've lived in that world, and I've pushed up against it long enough that like I can lean on that like a crutch, because it's part of my sound, right? And I think it's telling that guitar emulation didn't get to this. It's gotten to a point now where guitar emulation is almost indistinguishable. In a recording, guitar emulation is indistinguishable from the real thing. So much so that it's easier to get a good sound with emulation than it is with a real amp, because there's a lot less work involved. There's a lot less variables, right? But the only way we got there is impulse responses. An impulse response is a recording of a real amp, mixed in, like a sample that's mixed in with a digital emulation. So, right? So even what we call digital emulation is still, the backbone of it is analog. Whether it's a digital recording or not, it's an analog recording of it's an analog sound, right? Like you're taking a snapshot of a real amp.
Well, an impulse, it's not quite like that. I don't think. I might be wrong. You can keep me right if I am. An impulse, whether it's reverb or an amplifier or whatever it is simply. I say simply. It's not simple. It's you put a very instant. What's a peak? What's it called? A transient. You put a transient through any circuit, and the circuit will respond. If the transient is short enough, if the transient's long, what you get is just if you put a sine tone through a circuit, what you'll get is the response to that sine tone, but what you're hearing is the sine tone. So what you do is you put a very instant sound through something, and you get the circuit responds to that, and you can record that and model it. So you get like for a reverb is a great example. You clap your hand, and you get the sound of the room, and then you can say, oh well, that does this and that, and then you can create the sound of that room. And the same with any circuit, any amplifier, any speaker. So it's not that they're sampling it; it's that they're modeling the response that circuit and that speaker has. Is that what you think is happening?
Well, see, so I agree with all that, except for I'm still pretty sure the transient that they use to trigger it is a transient recording. Like, so when, like, Glenn Fricker, for example, Glenn Fricker has impulse responses he's given away and sold. He gave away a couple that I took that I use all the time. One's a 57 and one's a 440, the two mics he likes to record his heavy metal guitars with. And so, as far as I understand it, is he puts it in front of he sets up the mic exactly how he likes it on the cab he likes, records a chug of the guitar. It's a single, like, chunk with the guitar that takes that transient of that guy, and it's like a little, like, few millisecond wave file, because the impulse responses are wave files, and then that becomes like a mirror, like I said, that informs the program where to move things.
Right. Yes.
Know?
Yes.
So
I agree. Yeah, that's the way it works. Yeah, that's the way it works. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I know it's not actually the sound of the amp you're hearing, but it takes the sound of the amp and then models it.
Yeah, it models the response of the amp to the input, whatever it might, whether it's a chug or a click or whatever it is that you use. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, but before impulse responses, what we were doing is we were just A/Bing, right? Like, we were just basically using software and trying to program it to sound like an amp. Like, we'd be like, "Is that close?" And it's going back and forth and then someone said, "How about we try this?" And then once we started slicing and sampling, like the same thing that makes synthesizers great. We were talking about samples earlier. I think it's kind of what the secret ingredient was, which to me, for someone who's trying to make classic music and trying to emulate music they've already heard, it's great. But only recently am I seeing VSTs getting to a realm that I appreciate. Because for years, I've had to deal with VSTs that are emulating real-life things. Which, great. If you can't afford a $5,000 compressor and you want the $100 Waves plugin, do it. Like, if you really think that's going to give you the magic sauce you need. I love the way, like, people talk about how dry recordings sound without using these saturators and compressors. I don't use any of that shit. I love the way my synthesizer sounds plugged right into my sound card. It is so in your face. It's so immediate. There's nothing but what you want in there. Anything that's additional is something I chose to put in there. I'm not I'm not fighting artifacts. I'm adding artifacts, right?
Oh, I'm the same. I agree with that 100%.
So I think I like a VST that can make a sound I've never heard before. I don't want a VST that sounds like something else I've heard, and so I think that's being a product of that realm where people are unable to make VSTs sound like analog for whatever reason. Why the fuck would they? I don't know why they're even bothering. Like, it makes no sense to me that why you would try and make a VST that sounds like a tape machine, unless you're trying to break something, right? To me, because, like, why would I want to emulate the sound of tape when tape, we try to get away from tape, right?
Yeah.
And I know we've talked about records a lot. And I think we agree that, like, there's a guy at work who might be listening to the podcast. I know he's listened to a few episodes. A guy named Tom, I like Tom a lot. He's an eccentric like I am. He just retired from LG.
Hello, Tom.
And, yeah, and him and I got into a heated debate one day, not like an angry debate. Like Tom's a very respectful debater, which I love him for that, because him and I can disagree on a topic and still have respect for each other at the end of it, which is a rare thing nowadays. But one day he was like, "Okay, Chris, I think you're crazy to think records sound good. CDs are the way to go. Let's start showing each other links. Let's argue with links here." And we were doing it on WhatsApp on a public chat at work, so all of our coworkers could see us arguing about analog versus digital. Right. And I had to stop him right there and say, "Look, Tom, I agree with you." And he's like, "But I thought you like records." And I'm like, "I love records. I really do. But I agree CDs sound better." And he's like, "Then why are you buying records?" And I said, "Well, because if I buy the new Opeth record and I buy the new Opeth CD, the record sounds better." And he's like, "But I thought you said CDs sound better." I'm like, "Well, they do. But the guy that mixed the CD fucked up the CD, but the guy that mixed the album did a better job." And he's like, "Well, explain that." And I said, "Well, CDs, as far as I understand, especially nowadays, are meant to be listened to in the car, on the bus. Like the CDs aren't being packaged with the idea that the purchaser is going to listen to them in a CD player in the living room with their environment under control. It's going to be listened to in an environment where there's a lot of other stuff going on. So the dynamic range has been squashed so the listener can hear all the music amongst the noise of the world. Whereas with a record only gets listened to in a living room. No one's carrying around a portable record player. No one's listening to records in their car. So record only gets listened to like 99% of the time inside of an environment where dynamic range is encouraged rather than discouraged. So I was saying to him that I said, if I could, like if a band came out and said, "We have 2 CDs available. We have the audiophile mix and we have the general public mix," I would never buy a record. I would never buy another record. But they don't do that, right? So the vinyl mix, in most cases, is a better quality mix than the CD. Now,
when you say mix, do you mean the mastering? It must be the mastering that you're talking about, or do you mean the actual mix?
Well, there's both, depending on the band, right? If like Nine Inch Nails, for example, if Nine Inch Nails releases a CD and the record, they're completely different mixes.
Right? I didn't know that.
Yeah, so it's not just a master; there's level differences,
right?
Unless the mastering is so heavy that the EQ is letting other instruments shine, whereas it was squashing other things before. But to me, like the WAV file, like if I take a record and I record it through my computer, there's like it doesn't go above negative 12 dB. Like it'll go down to surface noise all the way up to negative 12 dBd. I put the CD in and it never goes below like 6 dBd, and it's always bouncing against 0. Like it's right there, like it's just hammering against 0. It doesn't clip, but it's banging right against 0, right? The same way like I master my music for YouTube and everything. That's what people want, right? Like they want like I aim for like negative 14 LUFS.
Oh yeah,
and right.
That's a whole other debate.
It is. But I found once I started aiming for that, I found my mixes the end product sounded a lot better.
Yeah.
And it still sounded loud enough, right? Because nothing is more annoying to me than when I put it on one of my mixes to show somebody and they can't hear it because it's not loud enough. Because all of our phones are limited now, so people aren't going deaf, and all of this car stereos, you can't, like back when I was a kid, you could crank up a car stereo so loud you blew the speakers. Right, but now it's like you crank it up the max and it's barely loud enough to shake your head. You know, like I'm like, yeah. I want 100 to be too loud. I want to be able to, I think, like a car should go too fast, a stereo should go too loud.
Yeah.
For me anyway. So I think like all of that is boiled down to this different appreciation for things. So yes, a properly mastered CD or Blu-ray, I think is far superior to any record any day, right? Like the high resolution Blu-ray audio is like this candy to me, but only a few guys do it right. Like Steve Wilson, I don't mind buying I prefer to buy a Steve Wilson CD over a Steve Wilson record.
Yeah.
Right. But Black Sabbath 13, I'm going to record the record for you again because I lost my recordings of that. They've remixed the album. I was listening because you asked me last time we talked if I've heard it elsewhere, and I had the digital download of it and the CD that came with the record and the record. They all sounded terrible. I went listen to it on YouTube Music the other day and it sounded way better than I remember it sounding. So I put the record on the other night and that sound was there. And the loudness problem. So somehow, I don't know if it was because of Apple Music or whatever. I was reading online, and apparently Apple was the first place where a better mix showed up. So I don't know if Apple demands control of a mix before it goes on iTunes for quality or something. Because I've heard a lot of people talk about how iTunes has superior mixes over everywhere else.
Well, they're now demanding Dolby Atmos, aren't they?
They are, yeah.
So I wonder if it's something to do with that. That's interesting, because after we talked about that, I extracted the files from the CD, and as we talked about before, I can only hear up to about 10K now, so I didn't hear the problem that you were talking about. So I extracted the files onto the computer and looked at them in the spectrograph, and right enough, there was the problem that you were talking about. A very nasty looking. I couldn't associate it with a particular instrument, but I think it is an instrument. It's a hi-hat or something. There's something somewhere.
Cymbals and guitar, I think, is what it's all part of the cymbals and the higher end of the higher strings of the guitar.
Yeah, and it's there at about I would say somewhere above 10K. There's this bright yellow blob that appears on the spectrograph, and I was quite surprised. And I thought, wow, I just didn't hear it at all, you know. So if there's a better mix, I'll need to try and get hold of that now. Yeah. Man, why would I? Because I can't hear it anyway. So what's the fucking point?
Well, yeah. Well, in your case, if it's not hurting your enjoyment of it, then why?
No,
right?
exactly.
And I never I remember a year or so ago, you sent me a picture of a Les Claypool CD you bought called Whales and Woe.
Uh-huh.
And there's a song in there that's got a horrible sound in it that I don't want to mention because I mentioned it to a friend one time, and he says he can't hear this. He can't listen to the song anymore. So I pointed out the anomaly. You know.
I didn't spot it. I have listened to that album, but I didn't spot it. So.
No, and my one friend says, well, because the song is about a blue collar worker that works around engines all the time, and my friend goes, he's probably just a tinnitus. It's supposed to simulate tinnitus of someone who works around loud things all the time. And I was like, that could be what they're trying to do, I guess. But why again would they do that? Like, what a terrible thing to do to a awesome song, you know. So I think that the preference of like what's considered good sound and like what are considered artifacts and useful, it's going to be a debate forever, you know. And there's going to be things that come out and anything that you know. So for me, like I love flying in the face of tradition while respecting it at the same time. Probably like Steve Wilson in that regards. I like to lean more towards the futuristic sound that Steve Wilson does, but I'm also younger than him and grew up in a different era too. Right? Like so. Steve Wilson has many times said the best music exists in the 80s, which I find hard to believe because the 80s is full of great music, but for me, it's some of the worst music ever made was made in the 80s, you know?
Yes, yeah, I agree with that, yeah. My period is from 69 to 79, that's that golden zone, you know, yeah. for me.
Yeah. Well, for me, I've always said that 1972 and 1973 I thought were the best years for music, but Stephen Wilson has a podcast out. We've talked about it a few times. It reminded me of similar to Listening Eyebrow, you know, from the way we began anyway, about talking about music that we love. Mm-hmm. His podcast is called The Album Years, and him and his buddy Tim from No Man, the singer from No Man, they go over years. I'll pick a year, sometime between 1967, I think, and some arbitrary year in the early aughts, where they considered albums to be important. They pick a random year and talk about all their favorite albums that year. And just before Christmas, they did an episode called 1977. And now they've done 4 episodes about 1977 because they can't stop.
They can't get out of it. Stuck. We're stuck.
Yeah, and my favorite album of all time was released in 1977. So I'm starting to think that maybe they're right. 77 might be the year because Pink Floyd Animals is considered for me is like my wear on the sleeve. Like that's my favorite album. Unfaltering, you know,
right?
Favorite album of all time, and I don't know why, other than the fact it's the hidden gem in the Pink Floyd catalog, you know, because everybody loves Dark Side of the Moon, and you should. Dark Side of the Moon is easy to love, but Animals isn't as easy to love, and we've talked about that. How like Pigs on the Wing are like terrible songs, you can't stand them, you know, but. I think you fell in love with the album a bit with the new remix. I think
I like the new remix. I still don't like the acoustic opening and the acoustic ending where Roger Waters brutalizes a guitar. It's not when you've got one of the best guitarists in the world in your band. What an insult to sit there and bash away badly on an acoustic, but it only lasts for a couple of minutes, so it's not too bad. And the rest of the album's brilliant. I love it. I mean, it's really good, and the message is great, the sound is great, you know, and everybody's working together. It sounds like, but there's still just that sort of extremely egotistical opening from Waters, you know.
We may have talked about this before too, but there's the original version of Pigs on the Wing is one song, right? They originally recorded it as one song, and it's the part 1 and part 2 with the solo in between the two of them. And for whatever reason, that solo got cut out and they just bookend the album with the two ones. But if you buy the 8-track version of the album, it's got the full version of Pigs on the Wing on it.
Oh, right.
And Dave Gilmour doesn't play the guitar solo. It's not, Dave Gilmour doesn't play anywhere on it. It's actually Snowy White that plays the guitar solo.
Ah, right. Okay.
So I'm wondering if the song was so terrible, Dave Gilmour says, I'm not going to even be part of this. This song is absolutely useless. You know, and I get it.